This lecture is part of the History 363 Modern Africa class at Flagler College. The discussion today centers on what we may call the road to independence. Really, we're talking here about the 1950s and some into the 1960s. We will extend this discussion in talking about South Africa all the way through the 1980s, actually, but that's an exception rather than the rule for what we'll be talking about here. And all of this will be in preparation for students giving presentations as part of this class on various nations in the post-colonial era of Africa, and hopefully this will set the stage for that nicely. So that's the goal. A few issues are really what we need to discuss first here. Things that were factors in the road to independence, obstacles or aids to that process of independence, and I think we'll see that there are things that function simultaneously as obstacles and aids at the same time, but that's part of the really complicated process of Africans gaining independence and forming their own nations. One of these is religious identity, and we've discussed this to some extent, and hopefully it's apparent from by now kind of what's going on here and why this would be a complicating factor. There's this line, if you can follow the mouse here. The border between the Muslim world, which is roughly right here, runs right through Nigeria, splits Nigeria roughly in half. Of course, extends down here all the way across Sudan, and then kind of northern Ethiopia, and then down the coast here of East Africa. This is we've talked about this as a historical factor in Africa, but religious identity becomes a major problem in this period of the gaining of independence in places where there is a religious divide. And so I mentioned Nigeria. We have a predominantly Muslim northern Nigeria and a predominantly Christian southern Nigeria. I mean, there are ethnic differences between these peoples as well, but the religion was really fundamental. There's also a kind of religious divide between the northern part of Sudan and the southern part, which is either indigenous African religion or to some extent Christianity. There are even parts of Africa where we find a divide between different forms of Islam. Over here in Sudan, again, we have kind of the northeastern part of Sudan here, which is, these are Sunni Muslims, and this is very much, it's not so much the Sunni-Shiite divide as the Arab, non-Arab divide in Islam. The northern part of Sudan is dominated by Arabs, by the Arabic language. The western part of Sudan, or the region called Darfur here, which extends over into Chad, was an indigenous African form of practiced an indigenous African form of Islam, and so historically there was a divide between this part of the Sudan and this part of the Sudan, just as there was a divide between the northern part of Sudan and southern part of Sudan. And this actually, we can, I think, extract a general rule from this. That is, the larger the country, the more likely it was to be divided either along religious or ethnic lines. And so some of these colonial borders were really problematic, especially when it came to Sudan, Nigeria, Congo, though not for reasons of religion, but rather for reasons of ethnicity and kind of regional identity. And even to some extent South Africa, which was really quite large, and we'll see that there are some problems there. The 19th century legacy is something we should be aware of. Reed, our textbook author, comes back to it again and again, and I think he's right in pointing it out as a major factor. The 19th century was simultaneously a creative and a violent one in Africa, and we can say that the violence was part of that creativity. But it was in the 19th century that people created these regional identities, often centered on political hegemonies, that were in rivalry with others. Well, many of these rivalries were then enclosed into colonial boundaries without ever being resolved. And so take Uganda here, a British colony, as an example of that. Or we could even talk about Rwanda and Burundi here. In the 19th century, there were rivalries in Uganda between the Buganda and the people called the Ganda and the people called the Inyoro, which extend even back into the 18th century, or maybe even earlier than that. Similarly, in Rwanda and Burundi, here in the Great Lakes region, there were rivalries that developed between the Hutu and the Tutsi that were still kind of in formation at that point, but they became crystallized as part of the indirect rule and system of privilege that was set up during the colonial era. And so in Uganda, for instance, the Kabaka of the Buganda kingdom was given pride of place, was set up as an indirect rule chief, and was given privileges that were not extended to other people in Uganda. And in fact, the Kabaka and the Ganda had extracted from the British a kind of favored status within the colony of Uganda. And so the colonial system just perpetuated the rivalries that were created in the 19th century. And when it came time for the granting of independence or the gaining of independence, many of those rivalries sort of emerged again. They'd been suppressed to some extent under colonialism, or at least the violence had been tamped down. Well, those rivalries, with all of their attendant violence and even atrocity and massacre, once again rose to the fore with a vengeance. And so, that's something that we need to be aware of here as well. There were a number of factors to determine not only the process of the gaining of independence, but also the kind of result of that. The things that we'll talk about when we get to a discussion of post-colonial Africa. Some of these colonies were actually quite cohesive in their structure. We could talk about the Protectorate of Bechuanaland down here, which was predominantly made up of a single ethnic group. Though there were actually a couple of minority groups there, but they didn't register in large enough numbers. There's also a fairly small population in Bechuanaland, and so when that was granted independence in 1966 by the British, became Botswana, the ethnic cohesiveness of it fostered a fairly stable situation. Actually, the same thing here with Lesotho and Swaziland, which were ethnically homogeneous. Other places, of course, were not. The most extreme example is the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or as it was known formerly, Zaire, which was ethnically diverse, sort of beyond belief. All of those people were enclosed in what became a single nation. And so the lack of cohesiveness led to a severely unstable situation there. Also, a factor in the gaining of independence were the levels of colonization. And there's a divide here between places that witness a peaceful transfer of power to a constitutional government, and places that were racked for years with violence before independence was finally granted, often on sort of coercive terms. And so the most violent places tend to be the places where the level of colonialism was the highest, which were annexations or full colonies with white settlers. And so there was a tremendous amount of violence. Maybe the most violent war of this entire period was the War of Independence in Algeria, where perhaps 1 million Algerians and a few thousand French settlers were killed. It took place over 8 years, prolonged conflict, and that was due to, I think, the fact that the French had annexed this and made it part of France. We see similar levels of violence, maybe not quite so much as Algeria, but but pretty high levels of violence in Kenya. Because there were a lot of white settlers there, and then of course we're going to see there's a lot of violence in South Africa and Rhodesia, which also had high levels of white settlement. So the level of colonization was a key factor. Resources also. Europeans wanted to keep their access to resources, things like minerals and agricultural products, and so they tried to negotiate independence, to grant independence on terms that would be favorable to them, and sometimes this backfired and there was a backlash against them. In some cases, there actually was a fairly peaceful transfer of power, but the resources remained a factor after that. In fact, as you give your presentations, um, uh, it's important for you to think about the question of resources and how resources have played a role um, in the post-colonial situation in these independent African nations. The level of economic development was also a key factor. In places which had a fairly high level of development, the transition often was more smooth, and the places were ready for this. And so Egypt, for instance, had industrialization, had the Suez Canal, had other things that gave it an advantage and led to a fairly stable uh, nation, at least initially, though there were some problems, as we'll see. Other places that had almost no economic development, apart from what was necessary to extract resources to benefit Europeans, had a difficult time because their nations were really behind the game once they gained independence. We talked about this a little bit already, about cohesion. But let me say one more thing about this, regionalism versus centralism. There was a great debate among people, seeking independence over the shape that their nation would take, and this is one of the things that led to led to the results, or kind of the way the process of independence unfolded. Nigeria is a good example of a country that was highly regionalized, that resisted centralization. We've talked about how in the northern part of Nigeria we have a predominantly Muslim group, ethnically the Hausa and Fulani peoples. In the southern part of Nigeria we have a predominantly Christian, more European influenced group, or rather a couple of different groups. The Yoruba in the southwestern part of Nigeria and the Igbo in the southeastern part of Nigeria, with various minority groups kind of scattered all throughout the country. And due to the strength of these three major regional groups, the process of independence unfolded with a tendency toward regionalism. And initially in Nigeria, there was a very regionalized political situation there. Other places there was a high degree of centralization. So, for instance, in Ethiopia, which had already been, and really, there's no gaining of independence for Ethiopia. It's already independent, but there's a highly centralized government there under Haile Selassie, the emperor, and we find centralized governments in Egypt and more or less in Ghana, though that kind of breaks down fairly quickly. Anyway, these are just a few examples of that trend. Large states or small states? There were some in pushing for independence who argued that the colonial boundaries were totally artificial. They were right in that respect, I think, and that they should be broken up, and in fact that these countries should fracture, should not respect the colonial boundaries. And so there were a lot of kind of breakaway movements at times, calling for small states rather than keeping the colonial boundaries. Others, argued for the necessary cohesion of these places. And that's a debate that to some extent keeps going on all the way to the present. So we've seen in recent years, just in the last 5 years, that South Sudan became independent, we might say, or broke off and formed a new nation only in 2011. This after many years of civil war in Sudan itself, and that's really an extension all the way to recent times of this argument for smaller states rather than larger ones, more ethnically and religiously homogeneous than divided among different peoples, which has led to a tendency of violence and violent interaction. This being the Cold War period, there's also a big debate over, which form of economy and economic organization that the independent nation should pursue. And both the United States and the Soviet Union were desperate to and their allies by extension. Britain was an American ally, of course, at this point, as was France. But there was a big. They tried actively to court the favor of African peoples and African leaders, and at times intervened to try to put a stop to what they saw as a spread of dangerous ideologies from the other side, from the diametrically opposed side in the Cold War. And so we're going to see a lot of kind of Cold War intervention in places like Angola and Mozambique, which did not gain independence until the mid-1970s. We also see that to some extent early on in the Congo and other places, because there were leaders who did, sorry for the yawn, not only flirt with communism, but even actively were propounding communist ideas and hanging around with Russian advisors. In Angola, which is kind of an extreme case, the Russians even organize troops, mostly Cuban troops, to be sent to Angola to help the particular rebel faction that they were supporting. And the United States provided similar kind of support to a rival faction, and this ended up tearing Angola apart for many, many years. Actually, a decade or more. We see civil war in Angola really over the question of communism versus capitalism, or that's a major component of it anyway. We already talked about white settlers, but it should be said that the identity of these independent nations at times had a lot to do with the white settlers. There's some amount of negotiation that goes on, and at times, in a couple of cases anyway, Rhodesia being the best example, but South Africa, I guess it could be said, is the same way, though its independence, as it were, kind of predates this period. The white settlers actually declare independence on their own. French settlers in Algeria tried to do the same thing. They tried to take over Algeria, tried to take over the government and expel the French, meaning the people from France, from intervening in their affairs. That didn't work. Rhodesia is successful at doing this for about 15 years or so, but they ultimately succumb to the native guerrilla fighters as well. We already mentioned this, but let me underscore it. There are some places that see a relatively peaceful transition, and other places that are racked by violence for years and years before there's any kind of full grant of independence. And a lot of that has to do with the presence of white settlers, or the level of colonization, or the availability of certain resources, and other issues produce these kinds of things. So we'll see that in some of the examples that I give. Sorry for these animations. I must have put in 2 layers without realizing it here. Okay, a few other issues. So there's this move, mostly in the 1950s. So we could point to some examples that extend into the 60s and 70s, or in the case of South Africa, Namibia, and a couple of others, all the way into the 1990s. This move from a strategy on the part of the colonial powers, or white South Africa or white Rhodesians, they kind of fit the same category. So their initial strategies, as the Africans were calling for independence, was to reform the system. And this primarily with the goal of producing a situation that, even if they had to ultimately hand independence to the African country, that it would remain loyal to the colonial metropole, and would continue as it had before to supply the resources that the colonial power desired. Um, and uh, and so so the reforms were aimed at handing over some power to the native Africans so that they felt that they were participating in government, though usually things like, the election of local councils or regional councils or even kind of parliamentary systems never had full authority, really were just given kind of secondary tasks, and all of the real power was kept in the hands of the colonial government of the metropole. Um, but this was supposed to, the goal here was to produce acceptable native leaders who were willing to continue to work with the colonial power. And so we see here in this picture, I think this is quite demonstrative, an image. The guy in the center here, dressed in the fancy robes, is the Kabaka of Uganda. His name was Yeka in the 1950s and 60s. And you can see that he's flanked on the one side, well, he's flanked on both sides actually, by British officers. I guess he's trailed here by a Ugandan military officer, but he's reviewing these Ugandan troops, or I should say just Gondan troops, because he is the king of Buganda after all. And as an indirect rule chief, as somebody who had already worked with the British, he was seen as the acceptable leader, and so the British really were invested, for a time at least, until there was backlash against this, in creating a situation where the Kabaka and his people felt that they had a voice in the government, that they had some power, but that they would still be friendly to British interests. That did backfire on them, and ultimately there was an uprising against the Kabaka and a full transformation of Uganda that resulted removing the traditional structures of power that extended back into the 19th and even 18th centuries from having hegemony over any of these places. And so, as the British were working with these, what they envisioned as acceptable native leaders, we often see the rise of radicals, some of whom were willing to court the favor of the Soviet Union, some of whom were just sort of fiercely anti-colonial in other respects, who had other ideas. Some of them, many of them, in fact, were intellectuals with a pan-African tendency, who saw the advisability in kind of colluding with and organizing across colonial lines with other African leaders. And these radicals often, I think in most cases, ended up achieving greater popularity than their accepted native leader counterparts who were already working with the colonial powers did. Now, I put here European guilt. This was a factor in the transfer of power. There were many instances of overreach on the part of the colonial power. And guilt really is the result in these cases of kind of international scandals. So maybe the best example here would be Kenya, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, where the British suppress very violently a years-long rebellion, and which cost, probably tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives of the kind of rural rebellious fighters called the Mau Mau. And then, due to the kind of revelations leaked in the press about the cruel methods the British had used to overcome the Mau Mau rebels, they felt bad about it. They, didn't want to create any more of a PR problem, and so, they began to move along a different strategy, which was to grant independence to the people of Kenya. Um, there were, of course, as we've talked about, political parties that rose in most of these colonies. Some did under the kind of tutelage of the colonial power and were seen as part of the acceptable structures of power. Others presented a challenge to those, and uh, the ones that were led by radicals tend to become more popular than the kind of acceptable to the colonial power or the colonial authorities party. And Ghana here is a good example that the United Gold Coast Convention, as it was called, ends up being completely superseded by the Convention People's Party of Kwame Nkrumah over the course of the late 40s and early 1950s, to the point where the UGCC, the one that was acceptable to and was working actively with the British, was totally supplanted, and the British ultimately turned their attention to, after recognizing that if they were going to deal with the native leaders, they had to deal with the ones that were popular, and so they turned their attention to the Convention People's Party. Again, Cold War fears should not be underestimated as a factor in many of these cases. The terms of the transfer of power often had a lot to do with the stance of the leaders of the Africans who were trying to gain independence. And it may be the case, even though there is some evidence for this, that the British or the Americans may have, if not actively participated, at least encouraged the removal, even if through violent means, of leaders who seemed not to be friendly to their interests in the Cold War sense, who seemed to have socialist or communist leanings. This is, after all, the period of heightened tension, the 1950s. This is the period of McCarthyism and the whole Red Scare. Into the early 1960s, we have the Cuban Missile Crisis, and so this is, this is the period when American school children were periodically, undergoing nuclear bomb drills in their nuclear attack drills in their schools, and people were building, insulated shelters to protect from radiation sickness in their backyards. And this fear was palpable, it was real, and it obviously influenced foreign policy, for good reason, I think. Well, that affected the way that both West and East, both the Americans and their allies on the one hand, and the Soviets on the other side, dealt with Africans and with this whole process of independence. And there were sometimes bribes, even, kind of, that if we hand over power to you, you have to promise that you're going to be a capitalist, and protect us from the communists. And this gave African leaders, at times, leverage to keep the Westerners at bay, as long as they were showing that they were somehow acting as a bulwark against the spread of communism. The Western leaders were willing to let them stay in place, even if they were doing terrible, terrible things to their own people. Maybe the best example there is Joseph Mobutu in the Congo, who I will talk about later. We talked about problems. Let me, the challenges faced with the whole prospect of independence. Let me outline those a little more thoroughly here. The lack of civil society, that is, structures that kept people in peace and harmony and that contributed to prosperity kind of outside of official government, was often lacking in Africa, as was a whole commitment to the rule of law. The African imagination was simply not constructed that way, necessarily, to think like a Westerner. And even though the colonial situation had tried to impose, or tried to create, to some extent, civil society and the rule of law, at times, as we've seen, the colonial powers were just more interested in extracting resources and getting rich off their colonies than they were about creating systems well, the lack of effort on the part of the colonial powers to put into place the structures that would contribute to stability and to democracy after the grant of independence ended up coming back to haunt not only Africa, but those Western powers who had controlled much of Africa. So the lack of civil society, the lack of the rule of law was a problem. Now, this is not to say that they were entirely absent. Certainly Africans did have structures that could be labeled civil society, but these were compromised at times by the legacies of the 19th century, by ethnic conflict, by historical rivalries, by religious differences, and those often superseded the question of having a civil society and having the rule of law in place. Lack of education. None of the colonial powers, I think it's safe to say that, none of them invested heavily in the education of Africans. They left this, as we have seen, mostly in the hands of missionaries. They had created some schools and even a few universities, but not enough of them. Now, some places were much worse off than others. Belgium, which had provided a fairly high level or I should say a fairly high proportion of percentage of primary education in the Congo and the other places they held in the Lakes region, did not do much with secondary education or higher education, to the point where there may have been fewer than 10 college-educated people in that entire gigantic country of the Congo at the time of independence. So lack of education was, I mean, this is striking. These people, were relying on traditional structures of power, which didn't cohere terribly well in most cases with nations, with the establishment of nations. And so that that leads to the regional and local conflict that we see that's just endemic during the post-colonial period in many parts of Africa. There's also the issue of, in places where the transfer of power was violent, the most common form of violence was guerrilla warfare. And those who were good at organizing and leading guerrilla warriors, or who at least inspired them, often did not make great politicians, great political leaders. The skills necessary to, enact strategies to keep fighting in the bush don't necessarily lead to, or don't necessarily translate to, civil society, the rule of law, stable political structures, sharing of power arrangements, checks and balances. That just doesn't work very well. The transition was tough, and it was not effective. And so all of these African dynamics, the legacies of the 19th century, the ethnic diversity, the religious conflict, the traditional structures of power and political and social organization, all of these things were obstacles to the establishment of stable nations on Western models, because really nationalism itself is a Western idea, and so it's difficult to have nations without buying into some of the Western systems of the Western ways of doing things. One final problem I will mention here is that South Africa, the nation of South Africa under apartheid, was a destabilizing influence all over Africa. That to protect themselves, to shore up their position politically and economically, especially in Africa as a whole, South Africa often sent warriors, sent armies into other parts of Africa to make sure that their interests would be met. And this was especially the case in southern Africa. South African troops ended up getting involved in conflicts in Zimbabwe, in Angola, in Namibia, which they occupied all the way to 1990, in Mozambique, and so forth and so on. They even, there were even South African troops who ended up later on in being involved in the civil war in Sierra Leone and a few other conflicts. And so, South Africa was was a real nuisance, and a real obstacle to uh, the stable gaining of independence. Okay, for the rest of this lecture, I'm going to go through a few examples here. This is not an exhaustive list, and again, this does not. The intention here is not to take away from the discussion of independent Africa, of post-colonial Africa, that will involve students giving presentations on individual nations here. This is really to set the table for that. In those presentations, you're welcome to return to some of the issues I'll talk about here, and I'm really going to try to do this in a more bare bones fashion than anything. So Egypt. Egypt technically had been independent since 1922, when the British handed power over to a king and there was a parliament elected, but as we've seen already, the British continued to interfere in Egyptian affairs, convincing the king to disband the parliament because they didn't like the Wafd Party. Later on, the rise of Muslim Brotherhood, they tried to stop the spread of the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood and its involvement in the political processes. And so we cannot say that Egypt was fully independent until there was a military coup in the early 1950s, and a military leader named Gamal Abdel Nasser became, first the kind of military dictator of Egypt, and eventually, via election, the president of Egypt. And Nasser is really the key figure in this whole period of Egyptian history. He's president all the way till his death in the late 1960s. Some of the things he did shored up Egypt's ability to function well as an independent nation. Some of the things he did were, I think it's safe to say, destabilizing factors. The one thing I'll point out here, which is really kind of key to the taking of power and the kind of last strike for independence, was that in 1956, Nasser seized control of the Suez Canal. It ran right through his country, after all, and kicked out the British administrators of the canal and declared that it was henceforth going to be the property of Egypt, and that no other country, that other countries, including Britain, needed to abide by the strictures that the Egyptian government would place. In other words, fees for traveling through the canal and stuff like that would place on the canal. Well, this prompted what was known as the Suez Crisis, with the British and the French, who were also mad at Egypt for their support of the rebels in Algeria, among other things, and also needed access to the Suez Canal. They colluded with the Israelis, who were the key historic enemies at this point of the Egyptian Muslims. That's going to get worse later, as we'll see if a student gives a presentation on Egypt. But this prompted a military invasion by mostly Israeli troops into Egypt, which erupted into an international scandal, and Britain and France really lost a lot of face, and the Israeli troops withdrew from Egypt and left Nasser in charge of the Suez. And Nasser would use the political capital that he gained in this, really what was more of a diplomatic victory than anything, to rise to greater power, really sort of full power in Egypt in the 1950s and 60s. The Gold Coast, or as it became known after independence, Ghana, is a very important case. This is the first of Britain's colonies, kind of full colonies. Egypt had been a protectorate rather than a colony, and we've already seen that that's kind of a special case, but it's its first colony to gain independence. It's also a great example of a colony that gained independence through diplomacy and transition, peaceful transition, rather than through violence. Though there would be violence later due to ethnic conflict and other factors in Ghana itself. The acceptable leader and the acceptable party that the British tried to set up as the natural partner and The one the British hoped to transfer power to was the United Gold Coast Convention Party, led by a guy named Joseph Donka. Um, but Donka was quickly superseded in popularity by Kwame Nkrumah, who you see pictured here in sort of traditional African garb. Kwame Nkrumah was an American-educated, partly American, partly British-educated Ghanaian who was highly charismatic, was one of the key leaders of the whole Pan-African movement in the 1940s, was maybe the most influential politician in sub-Saharan Africa of this whole period of history, though he, some of the things that he did later on would lead to a kind of ignominious damage to his reputation. But Kwame Nkrumah emerged that he had initially been part of the UGCC, but had alienated himself due to his radical views. He emerged at the head of the Convention People's Party, a rival party, as early as the late 1940s. Seeing him as a radical threat, the British actually arrested him and imprisoned him. But this only contributed to the popularity of the CPP. He became a sort of martyr figure for them during that period. And in the regional elections of 1951, that the British allowed in Gold Coast, really, again, trying to create partner institutions and reform the system rather than granting full independence. The Convention People's Party won huge majorities in most regions of Ghana, and this prompted the British to release Kwame Nkrumah from jail, thinking that the acknowledgement that he was probably more valuable to his party in jail than he was actually out trying to be a politician, the Gold Coast governor, Arden Clark was his name, ended up recognizing that Kwame Nkrumah was the only person with whom the British really could deal, and so they began negotiations with him. Kwame Nkrumah had led some nonviolent protests. He really was a thinker at this point in time, at least in the mold of Gandhi and others who advocated civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance. And with Nkrumah negotiating with the British, he was really quite a skilled diplomat and convinced the British to withdraw from the country, guaranteeing them actually that they would remain in a close economic relationship with Ghana. And he was to some extent true to his word there, though he would have other problems later. And so the British, seeing that they could work with Nkrumah, or perceiving they could anyway, they withdrew from Ghana, and Ghana received independence in 1957. And then things kind of went downhill from there. If we have a presentation on Ghana, or we talk about it later, we'll see that Nkrumah ended up having some issues as a leader of his country. Briefly, I mean, the situation in Nigeria is tremendously complex, and it's one that if we have no presentation on it, I definitely want to return to the question of Nigeria later. But Nigeria had been fomenting in different ways for independence since the end of the Second World War, and the British had tried to slow play them by the strategy of divide and conquer. They had been working with different groups in Nigeria, convincing them that it was not in their interest to declare independence nationally or try to gain independence nationally because they were a divided people. It would be a divided nation. And so the House of Fulani in the north in particular were very slow to come on board with the whole idea of independence. Once they did, it was only with the guarantee, and the Yoruba and the Igbo were on board with this, that each of the three main ethnic regions of Nigeria would be fairly regionally autonomous. And so even though there was at independence a national government, each of the regions, those three regions that I talked about earlier, had a lot of regional autonomy, a lot of self-government, made a lot of their own economic decisions. Later factors would complicate that and ultimately lead to a civil war by the end of the 1960s. So, Nigeria is a case, I think, of as there are many in Africa, of a failure of the initial governments upon gaining independence of maintaining stability. Algeria is maybe the best case of violent transfer of power, in the form of an 8-year guerrilla war that probably led to the deaths of more than 1 million people. It's a complicated story. There is a good film actually made of this called The Battle of Algiers, made in the late 1960s. It's an excellent film. It's one I would highly recommend. That really gets you into the whole Algerian situation. The main party pressing for independence was the Front de Libération Nationale, the FLN for short, and it waged a campaign of terrorism initially, and guerrilla warfare over the long run. So in the early 1950s, leaders of the FLN, including Ahmad Ben Bella, who ended up being kind of their main leader of the movement, committed acts of terrorism against French settler targets. And so they, committed violence, murder against French farmers, for instance. Also, acts of sabotage, blowing up houses and hotels and British businesses and things like this in the capital of Algiers. And this reached a very intense point that by 1954, 1955, the French retaliated and took soldiers into Algeria, forced the FLN out of the capital, except in kind of hidden pockets at various places in the capital, and so they continued to carry on, this kind of terrorist campaign and guerrilla warfare in Algiers. But many of them were driven out of the city, some of them into the desert where they had hiding places, but also some of them into Tunisia and into Egypt, where they carried out cross-border raids from Tunisia, at least. There was a great deal of support, not only from Tunisia, but also from the people of Tunis, but also from Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. And so these offensives didn't really work to supplant the FLN from the country. They just produced the effect of enhancing the view of the FLN in the eyes of most Algerians. As these offensives failed, many of the settlers tried politically to take over the country and become autonomous from France. That was not met with disapproval and ultimately resulted in failure. And the warfare continued, mostly guerrilla campaigns, sabotage, things like this, with the FLN active now in the entire country. Algiers itself was, much like we've seen in recent years in places like Baghdad and Kabul. It was sort of in the news every day with some new bombing, some new act of violence, all through the late 1950s and into the early 1960s. There were several attempts at negotiation, all of which failed. The UN in 1960 granted recognition of Algeria as a country that had a right to independence, and there was a great deal of international pressure placed on France. Even after that, it took 2 more years to finally negotiate the terms of independence. all the while violence was ongoing. When independence was granted in 1962, nearly all of the settlers of French origin fled the country, taking with them all of their possessions and destroying most of the infrastructure, the houses and buildings and other things that they had built. I suppose they said if we can't, or they thought if we can't have it, then nobody gets it. And so they left, what could have been an asset to the Algerians in ruins. That brought an end to it. Though there have been some historical animosities that have continued between Algeria and France. They have still enjoyed I think have had a relationship which is at times peaceful, at times tempestuous ever since. Kenya is another place that sees a great deal of violent transition, nearly as bloody as Algeria. In an effort to reform, now Kenya, remember, is a place of a high degree of white settlement, lots of British farmers, not nearly the population that existed in French Algeria, but still a significant number of white settlers who had owned a huge amount of the most prosperous agricultural land of Kenya, particularly in the so-called White Highlands of Kenya. Naturally, there were lots of protests, lots of calls for independence in the years after the Second World War, just as there were all over Africa. And so to try to reform the system and appease those who were calling for independence, the British set up multiracial councils to help govern the country. These were kind of regional councils that had both black and white members, and indeed members from the various ethnic groups of Kenya. Though all of the power, the majorities of all of these councils were white settlers, and so there was no way that there could have been substantive change politically through these councils. These definitely did not appease the Kenyans who wanted independence. So then we see, so at this point, on the one hand, we have these radical leaders in Kenya, many of whom had these Pan-African connections. Jomo Kenyatta was maybe the key figure here. But they lived mostly in the cities. These are intellectuals, and they acted really as the inspiration for rural Kenyans to carry out a campaign of guerrilla warfare that lasted for years. These people, some of whom are pictured down here under British British arrest, were known collectively as the Mau Mau rebels, and this became known as the Mau Mau Rebellion. It is uncertain where that word comes from. It is not a Kikuyu word. Most of the people who were part of the Mau Mau uprising were from the ethnic group known as the Kikuyu, though many of the people recruited by the British to help keep the peace and suppress the uprising were also Kikuyu, as the British were trying to divide that group, which was a fairly large ethnic group along these lines. And the violence continued all through the late 1950s. So from about 1956 to about 1960, the Mau Maus would, wage these guerrilla campaigns where they would attack British farms, kill British settlers, and then kind of blend back into the bush. The British ended up sending thousands of British troops into Kenya to try to quell the rebellion, and in the process, they committed mass atrocities against rural Kenyans, killing tens of thousands of them, arresting them, placing them in concentration camps, where they were victims of disease and starvation and things like this. And so there were lots of atrocities committed by the British as well as by the Mau Mau rebels. By about 1960, the Mau Mau uprising was over. The British had won, but they recognized that this was probably going to happen again, that these native Kenyans were not going to be happy living under British rule no matter the circumstances. And so there was a change, and some of this came with the kind of PR backlash against the British, that, with the revelations of atrocities in Kenya. Um, there was it's a PR nightmare, and so there was a change in British opinion, both popular opinion and governmental opinion. Even some of the settlers, some of them, of course, were angry and intransigent and wanted to hold on to their possessions, but many of them saw it increasingly as a risky proposition to stay in Kenya, and so the British set up systems of property transfer, and most of the white settlers ended up moving away from Kenya. The property transfer was a problem, though, because they offered these lands for sale, and only so the main people who had been fighting the Mau Mau rebellion were indigenous rural peoples who had little or no land themselves, who wanted to take some of the land that were constituted into these huge British-controlled plantations. Well, the British didn't want to hand over the land that way. They wanted to sell it to people who actually had money and resources. Well, these people, for the most part, lived in the cities, and so they ended up perpetuating the systems of exploitation that had existed under colonial rule, and post-colonial Kenya was a very, very much a divided country on lines of wealth and class. And we're going to see some of this next week as we read Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Petals of Blood, because the Mau Mau legacy and the failure of the British and the elite Kenyans to provide any sort of stable existence for the mass of poor Kenyans who had fought the Mau Mau revolt was striking, and this is exactly what Ngugi wa Thiong'o is criticizing in that book, and he does it through a variety of very creative ways, as we'll see. The Congo, we've already said, is a mess. Really had no business existing as a united entity under colonialism, and just the breathtaking ethnic and regional diversity of the Congo is a striking characteristic of that place. The Belgians, of course, had built an infrastructure to extract things like rubber from the country, and that was really their only consideration. They did not provide a lot of education, at least beyond the primary level, for their people, for the people of the Congo. And so it's understandable that regionalism was the rule of the day. Now, in about 1959, I think spooked by the Mau Mau revolt in Kenya, by some of the violence taking place in Algeria, by increasing calls for independence in the Congo itself, by a number of other factors, the Belgians decided to leave. And they decided this rather suddenly. After the Second World War, they had made absolutely no move in that direction. Claimed that they needed the Congo to help rebuild their own country, that they needed those resources, and so they hadn't done any sort of reform at this point to try to share power. They simply declared one day in 1959 that in 1 year they would hand over power to the Congolese people such that they could be independent. Well, there was a scramble, as it were. Now, a lot of this transition, this sudden transition, was influenced by the Cold War, because the British and the British and the Americans on the one hand, and the Soviets on the other, saw an opportunity to try to establish themselves in this part of Africa, in the heart of Africa here. Now, the only politician with the gravitas to try to pull together the whole Congolese project politically was the guy pictured here on the slide, Patrice Lumumba. He was a university-educated Congolese, one of the few in the country. Though he did have rather radical ideas, seems to have had socialist tendencies, had definitely at least opened up or left open the possibility that he might be more friendly to the Soviets and to the Americans. Quite frankly, he scared the bejesus out of the Americans and the British. And so, with the grant of independence, Lumumba won what elections took place, which were boycotted by most of the groups. Regionally, Lumumba's ethnic group was the primary one who participated. And then he tried over the next year or so or the next few months, that's all the longer he lasted, to try to pull the country together, to try to secure the resources, to try to stave off the inevitable breaking apart of the Congo. To do this, he was courting the favor of the Soviets. On a visit to one of the regions that was subject to a rival ethnic group, Lumumba was ambushed and killed, was assassinated, possibly with American and British backing, though there is no definitive proof about that. But Lumumba was taken out, and the one who ended up being the most friendly to Western interests was a military commander named Joseph Mobutu. Mobutu gained control of the army and ended up, through military means, not through political means as Lumumba was trying to do, but through military means, centralizing his power over the country. Now, Mobutu is somebody who needs to be discussed at greater length, so I will later on if we don't have a presentation about this. Suffice it to say at this point that it was a military strongman who was primarily interested in enriching himself and his cronies, who ended up taking control of the country by 1965, and that would be disastrous for the future history of the Congo. Briefly, Lusophone Africa, or Portuguese-speaking Africa, was also a site of violent transition because the Portuguese were unwilling to hand power over, really to entertain the possibility of letting go of these last colonies that they held from their proud tradition of interfering in the lives of other parts of the world. And then the Cold War, of course, got involved in this to a higher level, really, than any other place in Africa, with the Soviets organizing even Cuban troops to go there, and it gets terribly complicated. The Americans initially backed the claims of the Portuguese, but recognizing that the Portuguese really needed to get out, they eventually switched their backing to one of the rebel groups fomenting for independence and fighting against the Soviet-backed rebel group. This was the case in Angola and to a lesser extent also in Mozambique. And so international advisors, politicians, even troops at times got involved in all of this. South Africa sent their own troops into Angola, ended up occupying the country for a few years, eventually were driven out. And so this is a tremendously complicated situation, and the wars went on for a long time. Finally, South Africa. This is a special case, as we've already noted. We've talked about the structures of apartheid already, about the creation of the so-called homelands, about the creation of townships, about pass laws and separate facilities, and a white-dominated government, or I shouldn't say dominated, a white segregationist government where only white people had power in the government, had the right to vote. All others were considered foreigners in some sense. About the efforts of the apartheid government to divide people ethnically, cordoning off the Xhosa from the Zulu and the Sotho and the Tswana, and trying to create these ethnic enclaves via the homelands and separate neighborhoods in townships. To some extent they did succeed long term in that, because these ethnic rivalries would be the source of division between those who would otherwise protest against apartheid. On the other hand, the National Party, due largely to economic economic stability, and even I mean the economy of South Africa in the 1950s and 60s was roaring. It industrially and in terms and metallurgically, in terms of mining, South Africa was tremendously successful. Economic growth was at a very high rate, and the National Party reaped the benefits of that, to the point that the National Party, which had initially been totally dominated by Afrikaners, ended up becoming very popular among British peoples, to the extent where there really was no rival party, or a party that could rival the National Party at all. And so, this was the vehicle for white solidarity, the definitive unity of the Afrikaners with the British in the 1950s and 60s. And they even reached a point where they felt so unified and so successful that they could withdraw from the British Commonwealth in 1961. The man who did this, made the decision to do this, was Hendrik Verwoerd, the guy you see here pictured on Time magazine. And he was not only the architect of apartheid, but the one who broke South Africa away from involvement with the British, sort of on that intimate level that the Commonwealth provided. And South Africa decided to go it alone, and this was to distance South Africa from the criticism that the British and others in the West were leveling against them for apartheid. Now, the chief vehicle for resistance was the African National Congress. It wasn't the only one. In fact, a party known as the Pan-African Congress, which is really kind of an outgrowth of this whole Pan-African movement in Africa in the 1940s and 50s, and the various. Now there was. I mean, we need to differentiate between this South African political party and the so-called Pan-African Congress, which was a periodic meeting of African intellectuals, not only Africans but also people from the Caribbean and African Americans and others who were interested in African affairs. The Pan-African Congress was a party within South Africa who advocated for the unity of all black Africans. And so this ended up being a kind of rival party to the ANC, though they were mutually influential. Now, the initial strategy of the ANC leaders, starting in the late 1940s with the emergence of young men at the head of the movement. Now, two of them are pictured here. On the left we have Nelson Mandela, on the right we have Walter Sisulu. The other major leader of the ANC was Oliver Tambo, who had been the law partner in practice with Nelson Mandela. All of these men were Xhosa in ethnicity. They were all educated at Fort Hare University in the Transkei, a mission school there. All of them had background in law and had a legal career for a time. All of them were personally charismatic and highly committed to this. Really, some of the great figures of African history in the 20th century. I think Mandela probably towers above all the others because he was the one who lasted the longest, but Sisulu and Tambo were pretty formidable in their own right. They, following in the tradition of Gandhi, initially pursued passive resistance, boycotts, strikes, other things, and invariably the government reaction was violent. They, took in the police and violently suppressed these efforts. And it was during a protest in 1960 against passes, against the need to carry identification with them wherever they went, that the police opened fire in a place called Sharpeville, which was one of the townships outside of the city of Vereeniging, just south of Johannesburg. This became known as the Sharpeville Massacre. Something like 60 or 70 people were gunned down by the South African police, and this became a kind of cause célèbre in the international press, and a great deal more pressure was placed on South Africa. In fact, the system of sanctions dates from this time that some countries began to impose sanctions, economic sanctions on South Africa. And really with Sharpeville, the ANC shifted tactics. They created a sub-organization within the larger framework of the ANC known as Mkhonto we Sizwe. which is a Xhosa word, a Xhosa term meaning the spear of the nation. And this was essentially a terrorist organization. Ended up carrying out sabotage, bombings, of industrial installations, of mines. Not really so many civilian targets. The main target of Umkhonto we Sizwe were large institutions that were key to the South African economy. So they famously tried to blow up a massive oil refinery in the city of Secunda, for instance, in the early 1980s. And so this Umkhonto we Sizwe ended up operating for a long time with the sanction of Mandela and the other leaders of the ANC. Well, this only gave the government even more of an excuse to crack down as hard as they possibly could, and the leaders of the ANC ended up having to go into hiding. Technically, the ANC was an illegal organization. All African political parties and organizations like that had been banned, but they continued to operate nevertheless. In a police raid, most of the main leaders of the ANC were arrested in 1962. Mandela Sisulu being the foremost among them. Oliver Tambo ended up fleeing the country, ended up in Zambia, which had recently become independent and was sponsored by Zambia and led the ANC in exile, during which time it allied with other groups who were protesting and fighting against apartheid, including the South African Communist Party, which was backed to some extent by the Soviet Union. Mandela and Sisulu and others were tried and found guilty, initially sentenced to death. The sentences were commuted to life in prison with hard labor on Robben Island, which is this island off of the coast of Cape Town. And this picture was taken of Mandela and Sisulu in the rock quarry on Robben Island while they were being held prisoner there. For 20 plus years, Mandela and his cohort were kept in prison, had an 8 foot by 8 foot cell that they lived in, and had to work under fairly dangerous conditions, polluted conditions in the rock quarry on the island, which ended up compromising the health of many of them, including Mandela, who suffered from a chronic cough and other things thereafter. Now, despite all this violence, South Africa remained in fairly stable situation because of the economic prosperity and the growing power of the police and the military. And they managed to head off most international sanctions by using the Cold War as an excuse to, and they could point to the fact that the ANC was in cahoots with the South African Communist Party and with the Soviets to justify this, and so the British and the Americans and others refused to impose sanctions on South Africa. There were some countries in Europe who did impose such things, though, and certainly there was condemnation from the United Nations and other international bodies in that regard. The homelands during this period, there were governments set up in the homelands, but these were just puppets of the apartheid regime. In many cases, they were extremely corrupt, kind of taxing the people in unjust ways simply to fill their own pockets. This corruption was encouraged by the National Party government, really as a way to back up, I think, their racial ideas. The idea that Africans were just savages and barbarians and didn't know any better, and so such behavior was actively encouraged. The homelands, of course, didn't have their own outlets, could not make their own treaties or establish their own economic relationships with anybody outside of South Africa, so they were entirely controlled by the National Party government. And in the meantime, the growth of the urban areas, mostly with black laborers, became very acute, especially in the townships outside of Johannesburg and other places. And this is really where the kind of last stage in the struggle against apartheid began. In Soweto, in 1976, school students were protesting the education policies of the National Party, specifically the requirement that all black students were required to take Afrikaans as one of their required classes, and they saw this as absolutely worthless. The only reason to take Afrikaans was to communicate with their masters, as it were, which was exactly the reason why they tried to impose this on them. They wanted to learn English and other things that they could use to actually pursue their own economic opportunities. So this led to protests. During these protests, the police again opened fire on these school students. And the photo you see here on the right, the lower right, is one of the most famous photos of the 20th century. This is the first victim, a guy named Hector, a young boy, 13 years old, I believe, named Hector Peterson, who's here being carried by one of his friends or his brother, or I'm not sure exactly who this is in the picture, but he has been shot and killed, and this boy is running with his body away from the scene of the shooting. This hit the international, the stands of the international press, and became a kind of key photo in this whole effort. Led to more international sanctions, and to what amounted to massive uprisings in all of the townships of South Africa. Now, this was happening at the same time as, of course, the ANC leaders were all in prison or in exile. The key leader of the protests during this time was a guy named Steve Biko. Biko was the leader of university student organizations initially. That's where he got his start, but ended up being the main proponent of what was called black consciousness, which was critical, and it took some of its cues, I think, from Martin Luther King, though with a more militant side of Malcolm X, perhaps, but called for the unity of all blacks. Criticized white liberals who said they wanted to end apartheid, but who were ultimately the recipients of the benefits of apartheid, and said that blacks really couldn't partner with whites in this regard, that they needed to join together. He was an excellent writer, and his writings were really quite incendiary. Well, Biko was arrested around actually a couple of years before the Soweto uprising, and was beaten to death in police captivity. I should say the image on the top here is of what's known as the Casper vehicle, which was a police vehicle used during apartheid. These things are pretty large and pretty scary. They're basically moving the police tanks, armored vehicles. When I lived in South Africa and worked in townships in the 1990s, these things were still being used, and they were intimidating. And this really shows, I think, the power that the police had. There were even investigative wings of the police that functioned totally autonomously, using things like secret arrests and holding people without trial or without charges, and kidnapping, essentially, and using things like torture to extract confessions from people. And it gets really dark and really grisly in many, many instances. And so the black consciousness was one of the things that contributed to the Soweto uprising, as it came to be called. These uprisings all over South Africa, partly in protest of what happened in Soweto, and partly, to protest what had happened to Steve Biko, and partly simply to express themselves and their desire for a say in the government. The ANC underground was also working continuously, mostly through acts of terrorism, but also recruiting actively people. And they set up training camps in places like Zambia and Mozambique to train freedom fighters in what they saw as the coming militant struggle against apartheid. Now, through the 1980s, the National Party, under the leadership of P.W. Botha, remained mostly intransigent against anti-apartheid protests. The crackdowns among police were intense. The torture of people in custody was horrific. But all during this time, elements within the National Party, possibly even without the knowledge of Botha himself, were engaged in secret negotiations with Mandela and with others who were in exile. One of the key negotiators here was Thabo Mbeki, who ended up becoming the deputy vice president of Mandela after the multiracial elections, and was the second president of independent South Africa. But he met with National Party negotiators in England, where he lived over a period of many years. And Mandela was offered several bargains, we might say bribes, offered to be released from prison if he would condemn the ANC, if he would just withdraw himself from politics. Finally, after the P.W. Botha, I think he was very sick, ended up having to leave office. May have had a stroke. I can't remember exactly what the circumstances were. But he was followed by his succeeded by one of his deputies, Friedrich Wilhelm de Klerk, F.W. de Klerk, who became the prime minister in 1989. And one of the first things that de Klerk did was to make the declaration that Mandela would be released from prison and that the ANC would be legalized as a political entity. And so on February 11th, 1990, Mandela was released from prison. Now, South Africa was still a long way from multiracial elections. Over the course of the next 4 years and 3 months, there were intense negotiations between the National Party and the ANC and other groups, including a newly formed party of the Zulu people, really kind of a regional party under the leadership of Mangosuthu Buthelezi, the representative of the Zulus in KwaZulu. And much of the violence of this period took place between ANC supporters and Inkatha Freedom Party supporters. The IFP was completely unwilling to participate in the government unless they had a guarantee of regional autonomy for KwaZulu. A lot of provisions were made for them, guarantees were made for them, but Mandela held firm on keeping South Africa united. And finally, under pressure, really at the very last moment, only a week or so before the elections, Buthelezi caved, ended up on the ballot. Mandela won the election in 1994 and became the first president of South Africa after apartheid, sharing power with de Klerk, Thabo Mbeki, and Buthelezi, though with a clause in the Constitution that called for a sunset of this power-sharing arrangement. And after that, as we may talk about later, South Africa became really an ANC stronghold. Here is a picture of Mandela and de Klerk after the election, sort of showing solidarity, but in some ways this was more imagined than real, though it should be said that Mandela's courage and his diplomatic skill were immense. And I think that he is justly seen as one of the great heroes of the 20th century. Okay, so that part about South Africa takes us well beyond the the kind of period of the gaining of independence, but I thought we'd just go ahead and take care of that at this time. I realize that made this lecture go on for quite some time. So in subsequent classes, we'll talk about independent Africa. Of course, students are required to give presentations on individual countries. Then we'll end up in the final week in kind of recent issues.